I'd like to thank everyone for joining the session on this Sunday afternoon. We're going to ask everybody to mute your microphone and make sure your video is off so that Tom's presentation has no background noise or more faces than it should have at the moment. And then when it's time for discussion, you can turn your video back on. We'll have a short session of question and answer at the end of the talk. But if you would like to, if a question occurs to you while Tom is talking, you can go to the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, and type out a question. And what I'll do at the end is try to put those questions together and ask Tom to answer them one by one. So please go ahead and put your questions into the chat session. We also hope that you will, at the end of the session, go back to the homepage and watch Mitch Garabedian's short presentation about how SNAP has helped his clients. And if you want to, if you can, we'll ask that you make a donation to offset the cost of the conference. So today, our speaker is Tom Doyle. He's worked on clergy sex abuse since 1984. He's testified all over the country as an expert witness in trials. He's written countless articles and lectured all over. I'll just note that he was the first person I ever heard call the Catholic Church a bully. And wow, you know, why did it take me so long? He was ordained in 1970. He worked as a parish priest, a church administrator and teacher, and spent 19 years as an Air Force chaplain. He holds a doctorate in canon law, so he knows the rules, and he has a master's degree in philosophy, theology, church administration, canon law, and political science. So this is the guy. He's written 6 or 7 books, he's lost count, on the church. So if you want to know, where did this start? Where did this all come from? How does the church get away with it? What's going on inside the church? He's the guy to ask. And I recommend all of his books. It's a good way to educate yourself. So Tom, please bring us some new thoughts today.
Thank you. And first I want to thank the SNAP leadership for inviting me to speak today. Excuse me. Looking back, I was around when SNAP was founded by Barbara back in 1988. And I think I spoke for the first time at a SNAP conference in 2004, and I've spoken every year since then. So it is, it's always a privilege, and I'm very grateful for being asked again this year. Not because I'm so much interested in getting my face seen by a lot of people, but because I'm able, I think, to bring to the attention of a lot of people a bit of a handle on where things stand now, where things are going, and where the work that I do is going. I've been steadily involved in this issue since 1984. Through the years, I was in the Air Force. I remained involved. I remained in contact with victims, in contact with attorneys throughout those many years. And then when I left the Air Force in 2004, I continued. My plan at the time was to, because I'm a licensed addiction therapist, was to go to work for the VA doing a drug and alcohol addiction counseling. Well, that got deep sixed because the attorney said, well, can you stick around for a while to help us as an expert witness? And this was in 2004 when the cases were cascading as a result of the revelations in Boston in 2002. And I've been there ever since. I've testified, as she said, all over the country, but actually all over the world in several other countries besides the United States. So enough about me. Let me start and give you the presentation. The title is The Search for Answers, Interesting but Not Always Helpful Developments. Since this issue surfaced in 1983 and 1984, now let me just clearly say that was not the beginning of the reality of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy. That's been going on since the first century, since the beginning of the church itself. The church as an institution probably did not get formed up until the 3rd or 4th century, I think the 4th century, beginning of the 4th. But throughout these centuries, reality has been the sexual abuse of minors has been part and parcel of the life of the institutional Catholic Church. It was under a cover of deep secrecy for many years, for most of our lives, until 1983 and 1984, and 2 events were catalysts to push it to the surface. One was the encounter between Jeff Anderson, an attorney we all know, and a young man who was the victim of a former priest named Tom Adamson from Winona, Minnesota. And the other was the very famous case of the former Father Gilbert Gauthier in Lafayette, Louisiana. This was the one that garnered the most publicity because the media got involved directly with that, primarily because the case was all within statute of limitations and criminal charges were filed, and the media got involved with that. So that was the beginning. Many people think that this started in 2002 with Boston. Clearly not the case. That was a high point, but certainly not the beginning. Now, since this issue surfaced in 1983 and 1984, the institutional Catholic Church, first in the United States and then worldwide, has experienced a period of steady deterioration of credibility, a drainage of funds, and a loss of membership. Much, if not most, of this is related directly to its inability to deal with or cope with the issue of sexual violation of minors by clerics. I was present working at the Vatican Embassy when the Gilbert Gauthier situation first surfaced. I knew what sexual abuse was. I knew that it existed among the clergy. I had no idea how widespread, and I had no idea at that time. Well, I had some idea of the effects on the victims, but nothing like I learned within those first few weeks. At that time, in 1985 and 86, I was allied with 2 other people, Ray Mouton, an attorney who represented Gauthier from Louisiana, and who still is a very, very influential part of where we have been and where we are going, and Michael Peterson, a priest psychiatrist who passed away in 1987, who also was extremely influential. Very little is known or talked about those early years, but they were very, very important, and they were the beginning. Because it was at that time, and one of the things that struck me and hit me the hardest was when I realized that there was actually the formation of a cover-up going on among the bishops. And it wasn't all the bishops. It was the leadership of the American Bishops' Conference that was actually engineering the cover-up. They did not want this issue to become public. They did not want it publicly discussed. And they tried to convince the public and the media that they had all the answers and they had it under control, which of course was nonsense, absolute and total nonsense. Now, from that time, 1985, 1986, to now, I could not at that time have even begun to imagine or fantasize where this whole issue would take us. And I could not even begin to fantasize how it would change my history, my personal life, but also the history of the Roman Catholic Church, not only in the United States, but in the world. Sexual abuse now by clerics has been recognized in not only our own country, but around the world. And the leadership is being taken not by the church, by the bishops or the popes, but by the victims and their supporters. Primarily the victims, their supporters among the attorneys and therapists. This issue has forced the church and society in general to realize and accept the extremely serious nature of the sexual violation of children, of young adolescents, and adults as well. To accept it as something that is truly evil and in no way even justified or even remotely excused by anything or anyone. The violation of young adolescents by Catholic clerics, by monks and nuns, has been a known and documented reality among the followers of Christ since the first century. It existed among the loosely organized communities of believers in the first 3 centuries and continued after these communities were recognized by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, which was a change that actually marked the beginning of the church as a formal organized institution. And the revelation of this sordid reality in our own era has marked a radical change in the historic development of the way the church has dealt with sexual abuse and of the development of the church as an institution itself. And because for the first time in history, as I said, this has existed since the beginning. The first documented evidence of the church's awareness dates from the year 98, not 1998 or 1898, but 98, 098. Throughout the centuries, the issue has surfaced from time to time socially, become aware, the society's become aware of it. But throughout the centuries, the institutional church, namely the popes and the bishops, have been the ones who have directed the response. They have decided by what they've done and said how this issue would be handled. But now, for the first time in the church's history of almost 2,000 years, the trajectory of this highly destructive phenomenon is being changed. And it's being changed because the victims, the survivors, and their supporters have seized the reins and have taken control. And to use an analogy that I think gets the point across quite clearly, we are driving the bus. Not the popes, not the bishops, not the clergy. We are driving the bus and determining what will happen, how it will happen, and when it will happen. Had it not been for this courageous and aggressive approach by victims throughout the past 35, 36 years, we would not be talking today. This issue would have gone back on underground. It would have remained underground and undiscovered and unacknowledged. And there would be legions of severely damaged people still walking around in our midst. But the constantly burning question from the beginning has been why? Why do clerics and members of religious orders sexually violate young people, or sexually violate anybody for that matter? And why have bishops covered it up? Why has the welfare of the victims, most of them young adolescents, and most of these young adolescents being boys, why has the welfare of the victims, all of the victims, boys, girls, young, old, why has this never been given a top priority? And in fact, why has it never been given a priority at all? Throughout history, throughout our recent history since 1985 and 86, the top priority has continuously been the image and the welfare of the institutional Catholic Church. By that I mean the ruling elite, the bishops and the priests, and the bishops, the priests and the popes, excuse me. There is no historic evidence, and I have done probably as much, if not more, research into the history of this issue than anyone else. Richard Sipe, his wife Marianne, Patrick Wall, and I have devoted a good deal of our lives to the historic study of this issue. There has been no historic evidence discovered that I know of that the hierarchy have ever made any serious efforts or otherwise to comprehend the nature of clergy abuse, the profoundly serious impact on the victims, and the need for the spiritual and the emotional and the psychological healing of the victims. They've all said they understand this, but it has only been in recent years when the admission of this understanding has been, in a sense, forced on them. So the search for answers appears now to be a new priority in the church's history. But it has been spearheaded and to a great extent forced by lay people, especially the survivors. The institution has not gone ahead and looked for the answers. They have not probed, they have not forced themselves out there looking for the answers to the many questions that arise, because knowingly, most of these answers are going to be very embarrassing to the institution. The explanations, the excuses, and the possible answers have not been in short supply over the past 36 years. They've come from all ranks of the clergy, the media, the medical community, the left, the right, the center, and just about every ideological flavor in the church and in society. The last thing Richard Sipe said to me before his journey to eternity began was, "Tom, never stop asking why." And my love and my respect for Richard can't be measured, so I have continued to search. And over the 25 years that we've been doing this, in the 25 years I had known Richard, his wife Marianne, and then in a few years after that, Patrick Wall, we've been digging into every source we can find and every angle of this phenomenon that we could think of, trying to shine some light on the many burning questions, but especially the two. Why do priests do this? And why have the bishops covered it up? The search has been almost exclusively limited from all angles to the very narrow time frame of the present era, beginning in the 1940s and in the 1950s, and extending to the present. We all know about the John Jay studies. They've limited their search to the clergy between 1950 and, in the case of John Jay 1, 1950 to, I believe, 2002, and the second study, 1950 to 2010. There has been no movement backwards, back into church history beyond our era, beyond the 20th and the 19th centuries. And the focus has always been on the clerics and on the religious order members who committed the sexual abuse. Questions have been raised about the seminary system, about its impact on sexual and emotional maturity or lack thereof. The questions have been raised about the role of celibacy. This has been questioned for 36 years, since this has been on the table in our present era. The institutional church has staunchly defended mandatory celibacy, and in general has refused to look seriously at any of the studies or any of the research that has been done, especially that which has been done which related mandatory celibacy by clergy to the sexual abuse of minors. Putting my own bias aside, I believe that it is very true to say that Richard Sipe's work has been the most valuable work and the most relevant work, while at the same time the most threatening work that has been done on mandatory celibacy. It began with a 20-year ethnographic study of priests, and it continued up until a few days before he died. The results of his initial work, published in a book called The Secret World, were extremely threatening to the hierarchy, to the point that they demonized Dick and wrote his book off as useless. Well, we found out since then that everything he said in that book was totally true, and then some. Celibacy in itself does not force men or males, some males are not men, doesn't force us to turn to children or young adolescents for satisfaction for sexual needs. Celibacy does not automatically do that. But the issue is not simply that. That's the stark, bare bones issue. The issue is the erroneous and pessimistic notions of human sexuality, the indoctrination of seminarians to willingly accept celibacy, and the creation of what Richard referred to as a homosocial culture that has had an effect on the sexual, emotional, and social immaturity of many priests. Now, I bring this up because it's directly related to the historical roots that I'm going to get to in a few moments. The papal bureaucracy, the popes, in the Vatican, taking Pope John Paul II's lead, said and did nothing between 1984, when we knew that this became publicly known, until 1983, when John Paul II wrote his first letter to the American bishops, which was published at the end of June in 1993. In 1985, Father Mike Peterson was collaborating with medical colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, searching for factors and symptoms unique to Catholic clerics. And like Richard and Marianne Sipe, Dr. Peterson had been working with priests who had sexually abused children for years before 1985. No one in the hierarchy was interested. They were interested if it was one of their priests and the boom was going to be lowered on them, but they were not interested in general at this problem as a church issue, as a global issue. In 1985, after this all surfaced, Mike Peterson flew to Rome to confer with officials at the congregations of the clergy and Congregation for Religious. Now, Mike had been a psychiatrist before he was a priest, and his whole ministry was to disturbed priests, to helping bishops help priests. So he knew a great deal more about the sexual abuse of minors by priests than probably anyone else at that time. He knew about it. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew where this was going to go, and he predicted very accurately where it was going to go if nothing significant was done. And he was right, because it did go there and nothing significant was done. But he went to Rome to confer. He returned depressed and dejected because, as he told me on the night I picked him up at the airport, Tom, it was like talking to a bunch of gravestones. They were not interested. And they were not interested in listening to the issue, to his predictions, to some possible solutions. Now, John Paul II knew in detail about the nature and the extent of sexual abuse of children by clergy, at least from 1984. He knew what we knew in 1984. And he knew it in detail, at least from 1985. And I say that because I was tasked with writing a 42-page report on behalf of the papal nuncio, who signed off on the report, to send it to the Pope for his for him to read directly, which he did. Now, this report was detailed, it was graphic, it explained what this was, what it was going to do, what it did to victims. The report was given to the Pope by the late Cardinal John Crowell of Philadelphia. And Cardinal Crowell reported back to the papal nuncio that the Pope did receive it and he did read it, because I discussed it with him. Interestingly enough, in 2014, at the time of the Pope's canonization, his biographer, George Weigel, and his former press secretary, Joaquin Navarro-Valls, claimed, in response to questions at a press conference, that the Pope knew very little about the seriousness of this problem until 2002. And when I heard that, I flipped. And they also claimed that he was, according to Navarro-Valls, so pure that he could not conceive of a priest doing anything like was described as sexual abuse. Now, this was, of course, all total and utter nonsense. The Pope finally broke his silence in 1993 when he wrote a letter to the United States bishops. And in that letter, we have the beginning, I guess, of what we see as the Vatican's response at the time to one of the questions as to why, the causality issue. The Pope ended the letter by saying, quote, "America needs much prayer lest it lose its soul." He put the blame, first off, the most of the letter commiserated and sympathized with the bishops for the pain they were going through in dealing with this. And then he put the blame on American materialism and media sensationalism. And he stated that the most important way to respond to this issue was with prayer. He may as well not even have written the letter. It was worthless. But the Vatican's answer to causality for at least a decade was summarized in his clearly thoughtless analysis. His thoughts were parroted by various Vatican prelates from time to time, and only shifted as eruptions of clergy abuse began to happen in other countries. Some of the published research that had been done through the 90s was very valuable, insightful, and added a great deal to the understanding of the issue. But apart from the work of Richard Sipe and a sociologist named Anselm Shoup, it was limited to trying to explain why priests violated children. Make no mistake, much of this work was invaluable in advancing our knowledge of child abuse in general, but also our painful awareness of the socio-cultural and psychological factors in the clerical world and in the Catholic community that both nurtured sexually abusive clerics and also impeded any progressive steps toward meaningful change. And needless to say, the hierarchy and the Holy See remained defensive and primarily worried about image and financial security. No credible attempts at looking into causality factors emerged from the Holy See or from the bishops' conferences anywhere on the planet. There have been plenty of attempts at assigning blame. Some, especially noted members of the hierarchy, have gone so far as to claim that even victims are at fault because they're worldly wise and seduce otherwise naive clerics. Some have laid blame on the parents for not properly supervising their children. One diocese stretched this absurdity to the limit by accusing the parents of a victim of a priest, saying that they knew that priests abused children and therefore were negligent because they allowed their child, their son, to be around a priest. A not uncommon, but equally baseless attempt at naming causality has been to accuse victims and their attorneys of going after the church's money. Now, this usually goes arm in arm with the claims of numerous false accusations. Now, it's true that billions of dollars have been paid out in settlements and judgments, most of it in the United States. And it's also true that in far too many cases, the recipients of these awards have had their lives permanently ruined because of the church's willful negligence. There's no amount of money that can pay for or supplant a ruined life. And I've heard more victims than I can count say, it's not the money, it means nothing, it hasn't done anything. It hasn't helped me, it hasn't cured me, it hasn't alleviated the pain. It's just helped me get along better financially in this world. Now, at this point, it's very important, I think, to explain one of the fundamental reasons why victims have taken their claims to the civil courts, first in the United States, and then in civil courts in other countries. And this started in the 80s in this country. It started in the 80s when the very devout, loyal Catholic parents of a number of victims took their claims to civil attorneys. And they did so because their attempts at getting the church's attention were regularly rebuffed, they were lied to, they were ignored, or they were threatened by church authorities who almost always tried to shift the blame to the victims for trying to harm their precious church. And over the past 3 decades, the courageous victims and survivors have approached the civil courts in the US and throughout courts throughout the world because this is the forum. This is where much of the progress has taken place, because it's the one forum that cannot control the institutional church. It's been in the courts of our country especially, through the discovery of documentation and other heretofore hidden information, that we have learned about the extent of this issue and how best to confront it. Now, in the process of fighting the victims, which the bishops have done and spent hundreds of millions doing, and this money, by the way, comes from the lay members of the church, not from anywhere else. The bishops will say, well, none of the money we're using comes from the Sunday collections. Of course it doesn't, but it comes from other, accounts. And where does that money come from? It all comes from the lay people. The primary goal has been to preserve the image of the church and the financial security and the power base. It's only been in the past few years that there has been cracks in this mold of approaching the issue. However, in spite of the apologies, in spite of the protocols, the promises, in spite of all of this, there still remains a very strong bias against victims. And the most recent example of this, I think, has been the attempt of the Diocese of Rockville Center to challenge the New York Child Victims Act, which has ended in 2 court decisions against them. And in doing so, they hired the largest law firm in the world, which cost them, I'm sure, a big chunk of change. And all of that change, of course, came from the laity. As we all know, the continuous opposition to any changes in statutes of limitation in every state where it's been attempted, the opposition to the tune of millions of dollars has been mounted by the bishops of the state. Now, getting back to causality and answers why. The 2 sources that have received the most attention and the most support from the hierarchy, the Catholic laity, and segments of society in general, have been the influence of historic sociocultural forces in the United States and the presence of homosexuals in the clergy. There are significant forces among the hierarchy and in the church who want to put all the blame on men and women with a homosexual orientation. Now, that makes as much sense to me as saying the primary cause of adultery is heterosexuality. If we eliminate that, we won't have any problems with adultery. In spite of these claims that homosexuals and homosexuality are the primary cause, and still today there are papers and books being written that advance this theory, many of which have a lot of fallacious information in them. But in spite of this, some of the prominent sources on the church side have said quite clearly that the issue of homosexuality is not the cause of sexual abuse of children. The most prominent proponent of the first issue, that is the effects of sociocultural factors on the clergy and on the church, the most prominent proponent of that has been actually the Catholic bishops. And because the source comes from the second John Jay study called Causes and Contexts. And this was where this issue all came from. It says, quote, within the context of understanding sexual abuse in society and in other organizations, the goal of this study is to understand the factors that led to a sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. And what happened was they focused on, it's a sociological study, by the way, not a theological study, but sociological. The era where most of the sexual abuse events were dated, the era of ordination of most of the actual perpetrators was the period between 1970 and 1980. And those men were generally in the seminary during a period of intense social and sexual unrest in our country, the so-called this era of the 60s, the love generation. And so the John Jay study focused on this, claiming that this had a profound influence on priests. Now, their statement has to be read and understood within its context. It wasn't as clear-cut and as absolute as many have made it out to be. But it has been parroted by so many, claiming that it's because of this, because of these factors in society, that priests did what they did. Well, this, of course, is complete nonsense. The area, where they blamed a lot of this on the sexual revolution, this has led critics of the report to cynically refer to this as the Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix cause of sexual violation by clergy. Question, of course, comes up, well, what about the priests that were in formation in the 40s and the 50s? Well, the answer is obvious. It was Benny Goodman. So we know what those problems are. The bishops jumped on the report, many claiming that its conclusions were the definitive answer. And these conclusions put the blame, so to speak, on forces outside the institutional church, forces the church has traditionally opposed. Now, since the majority of non-adult victims of priests have been males, it's not unexpected that homosexuality would be named as a major cause for many, if not the major cause. There have been numerous articles and books published that have claimed to demonstrate conclusively that clerics whose sexual orientation is homosexual are disposed to sexually violate children. They've also claimed that the existence of a powerful homosexual subculture in the church aid and abet these perpetrators. But generally, these proponents of this opinion refuse to acknowledge homosexuality as an orientation. They consider it to be a behavioral option. Amazingly, one even finds support for what is often referred to as gay conversion therapy. On August 28, 2020, the Polish bishops issued a statement in which they are opting for the creation of clinics for people who wish to, quote, regain their sexual health and natural sexual orientation. I just finished reading a book that I have sitting somewhere on my desk. It's a compendium of articles about why this whole issue happened. And one of them contains an article by a priest who claims to be an expert in this. And he said that it's a myth to say that homosexuality cannot be reversed. And he opted for referring people who are gay to these clinics where their orientation can be reversed. Now, medical science in the United States, of course, has said this is voodoo. You know, they in some states have even outlawed its use, the so-called conversion therapy. And there are plenty of studies that say that it's highly, highly, highly destructive of individuals. Now, a complete discussion of the relationship of persons with a homosexual orientation and sexual abuse of children and minors requires much more time, space, and energy than this very short presentation can support. Now, I'd like to state at this point that between 1970 and 2020, at least 100 reports have been issued that concern the sexual abuse of minors by Catholic clergy and religious directly, or they've concerned the sexual health of the Catholic clergy, which is directly related. But these have ranged from official reports such as the 14 grand jury reports in the United States, the massive 15-volume report from the Australian Royal Commission, the reports of the investigative commissions mandated by the government of the Republic of Ireland. Most noteworthy of those were the Ferns, Murphy, Ryan, and Cloyne reports. The number also includes official reports from the Netherlands and Canada, as well as reports conducted and commissioned by various church agencies. Now, the consistency of the conclusions on causality in a number of these reports leads to the second section of this presentation. These conclusions, which are contained in reports from Canada, Ireland, Australia, the US, Netherlands, among others, all point to the negligent actions and responses of the bishops in the various countries, as well as the inadequate responses of the Holy See under Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. Although there's been a great deal of criticism of Pope Francis, as yet there's been no official report that has really examined in depth his own responses. Now, in looking at these responses and looking at the reports, and I've read every one of them, none of them on causality concerns itself with sociocultural factors, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, or anybody else in that era, nor do they concern themselves with the impact of homosexuality. They're focusing on the second and most important dimension of the sexual abuse of minors, and that is the response of the hierarchy. The attention the official church sources and other secular and religious-based sources has centered on the offenders, and hence the emphasis has been placed on sociocultural influences and homosexual influences, as I've said. But the emphasis needs to be placed not so much on the perpetrators, but on the system that has produced them, that has encouraged and in some instances enabled them, and that has refused to respond in a constructive and helpful manner to the victims. This is referred to by many as the systemic dimension. When the Boston Globe highlight team was investigating the church in Boston, and when it was investigating the issue that was going on there, primarily cardinal law, Marty Barron, the brand new editor of the newspaper, made a very prophetic statement. He said, don't focus on cardinal law, focus on the system. And that's where the focus needs to be, on the system, not the individual bishops or the individual popes, but on the system itself. The direction, the attention directed at this second dimension, at the system, given by the institutional church has been scandalously disproportionate to that given to the state of the perpetrators. And looking at the systemic dimension means taking the risk of delving deeply and hopefully objectively into the essential pillars of the institutional church, and including principally, but not exclusively, the nature and role of the ordained priesthood, and the nature and historic origins of the institutional church, or more specifically, the governmental structure. Looking at these two elements and the influence they have had on the church culture as such, and on the creation and sustenance of sexual abuse of minors by clerics is essential. Now, setting up tribunals to prosecute complicit bishops, defrocking cardinals, condemning clericalism do not equal probing the depths of the meaning and history of the priesthood and of the institution itself. Doing so is not only risky, but it's so terrifying for many that they fear even superficial discussions about it. And a classic example of this is the fear that Pope John II had about discussing mandatory celibacy or the ordination of women, which prompted him to issue a mandate that these issues could not even be discussed publicly or even privately by clerics and educators in the church. They could not discuss celibacy, could not discuss ordination of women, could not discuss the mandatory a married priesthood. Now, this type of behavior, although it's justified by appealing to fidelity to God's word, sounds a lot like totalitarianism, and it does sound like totalitarianism because that's exactly what it is. So the question is not why clerics sexually abuse minors, but why the hierarchy, the bishops, the so-called pillars of the institutional church, have not only tacitly approved this travesty, but encouraged and supported it by demonizing victims, by protecting perpetrators, and by penalizing anyone, especially from the inside, who would have the courage to stand and publicly question the hierarchy's essential role. Every cleric that I know of, and every religious woman that I know of, and there haven't been many, who stood up publicly and called into question the church's response, has been in some way or other penalized, either driven from the active ministry, otherwise penalized, or in some way has been, they have not been rewarded for their courage. So the vitally important questions, I think, that must be confronted are many, but they can be summed up by the following. First, what is the source, the validity, and the objective justification for the theological and cultural beliefs about the priesthood that place it in such an exalted and powerful position? Number two, is there any plausible or credible reason why children, adolescents, and women have been given such disparaging treatment through the history of the church? Three, how do the church leaders, or any believers for that matter, explain the systemic condoning of behaviors by clerics that are blatantly contrary to the words of Jesus Christ as recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Fourth, what is the authentic, historic, and scriptural basis for the traditional beliefs about the office and role of bishops and the monarchical governmental system of the church that justifies their self-dispensation from any degree of accountability? Fifth, what is the authentic historical basis for the belief and practice that celibacy of some of the clergy cannot be changed? What is the basis for believing and saying that this is infallible, as the Polish bishops did? There is no basis. Sixth, why have the hierarchy down through the centuries been afraid to challenge and re-examine the church's traditional teaching and beliefs about human sexuality? Popes and bishops throughout history have been deathly afraid of questioning the validity of the beliefs that support the church's governmental structure, and all of these do. They've been afraid of challenging the beliefs that have placed the clergy, the bishops and priests, on these exalted pillars. They've been afraid to challenge the exalted and even magical notions about the ordained and consequent clerical subculture. Why? Not because there's any fear that the higher power will swoop down with a vengeance for questioning the unquestionable, but because to do so, to question it, will seriously threaten the security and the power of the clerical elite. The lens, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been limited to the 20th and 21st centuries. Speculating on the reasons for closing the lens so that it stops with the 20th century is probably a waste of time, but the fact is it has. No matter how daunting or how irrelevant medieval scholarship may seem to some, the fact remains that this is the key to the understanding of the origins and the foundations of the church we have today, and it is the key to understanding the foundations and the origins to the issue of the sexual violation of minors and what we have in it in this era in the church. And to date, there's been very, very little research or scholarly discussion about the historical roots of clerical sexual behavior with minors. There's likewise been scant attention paid to the origins and the evolutionary development of clerical celibacy. Dick Sipe, Pat Wall, and I published a book in 2006 titled Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes. And in this book, we tried to trace the documentary history of clergy sexual abuse based on punitive documentation, that which we could find. An Australian scholar named Kieran Tapsell has also done some significant research into medieval sources. But our collective focus has been on documentation that illustrated the official church's attempts at controlling the problem by punishing offenders. This, unfortunately or fortunately, is a minor tip of a huge iceberg. And the rest of this iceberg has been exposed, uncovered, for the first time in history by a medieval scholar from Northwestern University in Chicago named Diane Elliott. She has taken research into clergy sexual abuse to an entirely new level. And her work will be published in November under the title The Corrupter of Boys, Sodomy, Scandal, and the Medieval Clergy. And I was privileged to be an advanced reader of the manuscript. And the research has uncovered historical information that heretofore has not been known. Or if it's been known, it's been kept deeply covered. Historical information that radically changes the conversation because it provides the historic answers to many of the questions that have remained open only because no one has had the commitment, the ability, the insight, or the money into the value of searching back through history. And I use many of Dr. Elliott's, some of her key findings to connect these findings from the earliest centuries, 4th, 5th centuries, to today, a direct line between practices at that time and what we have seen in our own era. The title of the book aptly sums up what has been described as an especially destructive and toxic dimension of the Catholic Church's dark side. The corrupter of youth, the title, is not about a person, but it's about an entire ecclesiastical system. The elements of the Catholic entity that come together to enable the corrupter are rooted in the Church's theological teachings and traditions, in its culture, in its canonical or legal tradition, and in its assimilation of ideas and behavior patterns from the secular culture. The author says in her introduction, and in this she first refers to the grand jury report from the state of Pennsylvania. Quote, "The report from the grand jury in Pennsylvania had only helped to confirm my dark premise. What we are witnessing in the contemporary church is no aberration, but a continuation of a practice that has spanned centuries." Her research reaches back to the 1st century. The elements of the essential aspects of what she refers to as the continuation of a practice are these: the perpetrators, namely the clerics, the clerical culture of privilege and protection, the victims and attitudes toward the victims, the deference to the hierarchy, the avoidance of scandal and the protection of the church's image, and institutionalized misogyny.
Tom?
Yes.
We've got just 3 or 4 more minutes, and then we should start the question and answer period.
Okay, I'm winding it up.
All right.
What I want to say then in this brief period of summary, and I've only got a few pages, but I'll cut it short. First off, Dr. Elliott found that there was widespread pederasty, in other words, relationships between clerics and young adolescent boys throughout church history, but it was tacitly ignored and even accepted by church authorities because their primary concern was dealing with married priests and trying to get them to stop having relationships with their wives and imposing mandatory celibacy on everyone. Secondly, the victims themselves were looked upon by society and by the church in a very negative manner. They were looked upon as young adolescent boys were looked upon as seducers. This was an official view toward them. There was no sense of children or adolescents, no sense of respect for them, of valuing them as we do today. And so the primary problem when a cleric got caught with a young adolescent boy, if there was some kind of retribution or punishment of any kind, he got a slap on the wrist while the victim was severely punished. So the victims really were not considered to be victims. They, in a sense, were the perpetrators. Clerical privilege, clergy privilege began in that era, and it began because clerical celibacy was key to maintaining the distinction of the priests as highly special, exalted individuals. There's a causal relationship between a celibate clergy and widespread sexual abuse of adolescent males. Another dimension of this has been the fact that throughout the medieval period of history, there's very, very little example of priests being hauled into ecclesiastical courts and prosecuted for the violation of young boys. Now, the parallels, it's the same thing today. Church tribunals were rarely, if ever, used until the turn of the 21st century. Rarely, if ever, used. Children were then, in the early centuries, looked on in a very pejorative manner, and even in today's church, in our own experience, I can cite examples of high-ranking clergy blaming the victims for seducing naive clerics, or blaming the parents for allowing their children to grow up in a non-moral environment. So the victims in many ways were blamed then, just as they have been blamed now. So we find a lot of similarities in the response of the church in the earliest years and at the present time. Now, why is this important? This is important because as we're looking for these answers, we can come to the conclusion that the answers mean the questions have existed for 2,000 years, and the answers, because what we're experiencing now was going on then, not just the violation of children, but all the subculture behind it, all the aspects of it that I've just mentioned. And so to change this issue means we have to look deeply and honestly at these answers and why, at these initial early factors and why they existed and why they have persisted through the centuries, so that we can honestly say that the issue we're dealing with will be with us until the system that has caused it is radically changed. Hopefully, those of us who are pessimistic will be proven wrong, and someday the system will change, and children and others will be constitutionally safe, no matter what. Thank you very much for allowing me to go overboard or over time. I appreciate it very much.
Okay, very, very informative, fascinating information. So a couple of questions have appeared in the chat box, and I want to pass them on to you.
Okay.
One person asked, in terms of Pope Francis, was his meeting with Juan Carlos did it make any difference? Is there any evidence that it made a difference?
Well, the only evidence I have is from Juan Carlos himself, and I think it did make a tremendous amount of difference, because had he not intervened along with the other victims at the time, Pope Francis wouldn't have woken up and smelled the coffee. Now, what he can do or not do about the issue is another question. But Juan Carlos has had a very open and a very direct relationship with the Pope, and he's been very blunt with him. So I think the meeting did have an effect, at least in Chile and in other areas of Latin America.
Okay, great.
But one thing I got to mention, and I know this for a fact, whether you think the Pope has been helpful or not helpful, you have to take into consideration the fact that he is living and working in a lion's den. He's living and working in a snake pit, because he's got to deal with the Vatican Curia. And the Vatican Curia is extremely powerful, extremely divisive, and can turn, up into down easily and make you wonder, whether you're going backwards or forwards.
Absolutely, yeah. Another question is just if you would repeat the title of your book.
Which book? Okay, it's Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes.
Yeah.
And the entire title is Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes: The Documentary History of the Church, the 2,000-year history of the Church's violation of minors. And it's all based on authentic documentation. The book reaches only back to the 4th century. But it's pretty much there. But as I said, it's the small tip of a huge iceberg. Yeah,
I've read it. It's great. It's really good.
Well, I got to tell you, this one that I mentioned by Diane Elliott.
Diane Elliott, yeah.
It's a blockbuster. It's coming out in November, but I read it. It blew me away because it significantly changes the concept. I only gave it a little tiny bit of a summary, but it's packed with invaluable information and unbelievable research that, as I said, when it is publicized, when it's seen, when it's brought into the public eye, it's going to make a big, big difference.
Okay. And it looks like it's coming out from University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, University of Pennsylvania Publishing House is the one that's publishing it. She is a professor at Northwestern University, which is in Evanston, Illinois, north of Chicago.
Okay. Okay, other question. Oh, someone is asking, is the paper you gave today available as a video or a text?
Well, it'll be available as a text when I get done finishing it off. I've gotten most of it done, and I'm going to spend a part of this week polishing it up, finishing it off as a full text, not just an outline, and then I'll send it. It's going to go to Snap, to Dick Sipe's website, and from there to the abuse tracker.
Great. Okay. All right. Okay. Any other questions? We've got 1 minute. Yeah. Tom,
I have a question.
Okay.
I posted it, but Tom, do you consider yourself an apostate?
I don't even know what an apostate is.
Well, an apostate is someone that takes a negative about-face turn on a religion, is the way I understand it. There's apostates in the Muslim world. There's apostates in
Well, let me just answer it by saying that my relationship with I'm mainly critical of the institutional church and about things that the institution has done, which is different than the Catholic Church, which is the body of Christ, the believers. What I believe, what my theological beliefs are irrelevant. This is not about theology. This is about violation of kids and violation of trust. So whether I'm an apostate, a heretic, an agnostic, or an atheist, I'm probably all of those at one time or another in the course of any week.
I get that, because that's why I asked the question. I feel the same way.
Okay.
Tom, there was also a question that somebody wanted to know about, does your information support that half of the victims are girls?
No, it doesn't. There's no information that supports that half of the victims of sexual violation, young victims, by that I mean adolescent victims. The data supports that 80% of the adolescents, and most of the victims, 80% of the victims are young adolescents, or maybe 85. A very small percentage are actual prepubescent children. So really, it's not a pedophile issue. That's a small part of the issue. It's an issue of the violation of vulnerable kids. And 80% of the victims have been seen to be young boys, because that is historically the way it works. Now, there's been there are a significant minority of young girls, and I've worked with a number of them, but the majority are men, are boys, have been boys.
Tom?
I have a question on the board.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so the question, it's already in chat, is why are we not going after the institution? Why are we focusing on individual abuses against children? Why do we not go after the organization that created and gave them home?
Well, we are going after the organization, because every time there's a lawsuit, it's not after the individual abusers, it's after the institutional church, which is broken up into dioceses, and each diocese is independent. And so the court action, which is where the action is in the court. You can preach, you can write books, you can scream, yell, threaten until you're blue in the face. That won't change anything. It's in the courts where the action is, and they go after the institution. And there are several court cases pending right now that are naming the Holy See as a defendant.
Well, that would be true in the case of the New Orleans Archdiocese, which are currently in bankruptcy court. But I want to know, why does law enforcement not first go after the institution? There's a graveyard of documentation that implicates them. They say that they turn over documents to law enforcement, but after our investigations, we find out that they don't turn over those documents to law enforcement. So why isn't state government and the federal government going after the institution for this systematic rape of our children?
Well, in fact, as I said, it is, but it's not doing it as en banc, as going after the federal government, but in for example, the grand jury investigations, and a number of these are going on in various states right now, are going after the documentation held by individual dioceses. There's no one depository for all documentation in this country. It rests with each diocese individually. So the only way you're going to get it is to go to the diocese. I've been working with about 8 attorneys general, and I know they're aggressively working to get this documentation, but they have to do it in one of 2 ways. Either they get a warrant from a judge that enables them to walk into the chancery and take everything out, which has been done in a number of cases, or they go through the courts with subpoenas, and then you're faced with battling the church's lawyers that can put up a long, expensive, and eventually losing battle.
I'm afraid we have to shut down. I know we could talk about issues raised for hours, but we're out of time, and so it is time to end the session. Tom, we want to thank you for your presentation and for all that you've done for survivors.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And the session is at the end. Thank you.
So, okay.